Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Distinguished guests, on behalf of the B20 Secretariat, welcome to the SME and Entrepreneurship session. It's a pleasure to see all of you here this afternoon. As you know, the B20 has organized itself around 6 task forces, and the SME and Entrepreneurship is the new task force. Today we'll discuss challenges related to SMEs, and we'll discuss proposed solutions by the B20, how to solve them. It's really an honor to have Nail Olpak today with us. Mr. Olpak is president of MUSIAD and a member of the B20 Executive Committee. Now let me give the floor to Mr. Olpak. Welcome.
Dear Chair, Moderator, panelists, and really valuable participants at this time of the day. Welcome you all again for behalf of MUSIAD and B20 Turkey Executive Committee. Since the Chair, Melih Yurtar, and the panelists will speak deeply about the subject, in an opening remark, I want to point out 2 issues only. First of all, as you know, during Turkey's presidency, there are new initiatives such as W20 or IBAC members meeting with the ministers and such as. By doing so, we are moving to achieve one of those 3 I's. This I is inclusiveness. Then we will continue towards implementation. But I believe more important than having other new initiatives is integration of SME task force among other task force, and also integration of SME task force like an auxiliary issue under all other task forces. Here, I want to say that I am proud of being the president of MUSIAD, which had proposed to add this SME issue as a task force, and of course, I want to thank to everyone who accepted this proposal. Especially, I believe, with this step, B20 declared that from now on, we are not going to deal with the problems, solutions, or targets of not only 20 countries, just the contrary, we will deal with that of the whole world. This decision is a milestone for B20, and coming to this concept, according to me again, is much more important than the contents of what we have been discussing so far. The second point, when we have a quick look to the problems of SMEs, we may speak about innovation, creativity, R&D, access to global market, and such as. Here I believe, among the others, one of the most important facts is access to finance with the right timing and with competitive conditions. In general, SMEs spent some important money for land and building at the beginning, then try to invest for machinery, and when it comes to running capital, they generally ask that money from the bank. Here the problem starts. In most countries, and Turkey is one of them, especially SME financing depends only on the collaterals, not on the projects. I believe this is not a healthy financing method, neither for SMEs nor the banks. Banks also should not be satisfied from standing on collaterals, but they seem to enjoy this funny situation. Of course, I do not mean that everything will be okay when we solve access to finance problem. But without solving this issue, SMEs cannot deal with the others. With those remarks, I wish to have a good panel, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Olpak. It was very inspiring. Today, we have a pleasure of having Mr. Melih Yurtar with us. Mr. Yurter is a board member of Afyon Energy and the coordinating chair of the SME and Entrepreneurship Task Force. We've been honored to have Mr. Yurter with us throughout this whole year. Thank you for this, and welcome for your opening remarks.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, distinguished guests. It's an honor to speak with you here today about SMEs, the drivers of the global economy, as we know. Before I begin my speech, I would like to thank President Erdogan, Prime Minister Davutoğlu, and Chairman of TOBB, Mr. Hisarcıklıoğlu, because all of them have mentioned the importance of the SMEs for the national economies and global economies. And within these last 2 days, we have seen that the favorite topic of the B20 during the Turkish presidency is the SMEs and entrepreneurship. Having forums such as these presents a great opportunity to advance the global agenda and to address many of the systematic issues affecting the small and medium-sized business today. Promoting small businesses and entrepreneurship has received an enormous amount of attention in recent G20 cycles, and rightfully so. We have heard about so many different data relating with SMEs yesterday and today, so I'm not going to repeat those data relating with SMEs again. But 3 main figures I would like to inform you. SMEs account for 90% of all firms globally. In fact, this is an average number. In my country, in Turkey, this is about 99%, but in most advanced economies, this dropped down to 80s, 82%. But on average, it is 90%. They employ over 60% of the global workforce, and they provide 80% of the net job growth. With all of this in mind, the Turkish delegation to the G20 Australia Summit suggested creating a new task force on SMEs and entrepreneurship last year in association with the 5 that existed under the Australian B20 presidency. And as you know, these are trade, infrastructure and investment, financing growth, employment and anti-corruption. Turkish Deputy Prime Minister Mr. Ali Babacan appointed 7 prominent business organization leaders to guide the work of the B20 task forces in year 2015 under the leadership of TOBB, President Rifat Hisarcıklıoğlu, and B20 Sherpa, Mr. Sarp Kalkan. The SMEs and Entrepreneurship Task Force was established under the leadership of myself, Melih Yurter, board member of the Afyon Energy, and Mary Andriga, CEO and chair of the board, Vermeer Corporation, as coordinating chairs. Göktekin Dinçerler, director at Turkven Private Equity, Diane Wong, founder and CEO of the DHgate.com, and Pierre Nantmier, the chairman of the CEO of the Accenture, are the co-chairs of the task force. The task force was comprised of 110 members, 65 of them executives from SMEs and entrepreneurs, 13% of them from representatives of large firms, and 22% of them from representatives of the global institutions such as the World Bank, OECD, IMF, ITC, and business associations from G20 countries, particularly from Turkey, United States, European Union, and China. Task force members suggested more than 80 recommendations under the different topics. The task force voted to prioritize the issues using a mechanism that also took account of the polling at the B20's regional consultations, and the long list was sharpened through an iterative process to produce a final list of 5 priority recommendations. These are access to international markets, access to finance, access to skills and talent, access to innovative ecosystem and digital economy, and ability to comply with business regulations. Additionally, the B20 SMEs and Entrepreneurship Task Force supported the creation of the World SME Forum, which is WSF, along a global SMEs platform oriented to support the implementations of the proposed recommendations and unleash the potential of the SMEs sector. In fact, I'm calling WSF as a voice of SMEs. The WSF was founded through a partnership between the Union of Chambers and Commodity Exchange of Turkey, TOBB, the International Chamber of Commerce, and the ICC's World Chamber Federation's WCF, and it was formally announced on May 23, 2015. The WSF is based in Istanbul, and its agenda will be developed and implemented in cooperation with multilateral organizations, think tanks, policymakers, and the business community. Needless to say, we are excited by the potential of the WSF and the amount of the good it can do for SMEs around the world. I would like to thank to all our task force members for their contributions during our national meetings and also regional meetings. And I would like to thank also all other staff who were in our kitchen to prepare all those documents and informations which we are needed during the workshops. Thank you. Now I would like to leave the stage to Lawrence.
Many thanks, Mr. Yotter. Is the microphone working well? Can you hear me? Perfect. I'm Laurence Morvan from Accenture. Very happy to have been the knowledge partner this year on this new task force. Our objective this year, you've heard many times, this is a new task force. Our objective as a task force has been to establish a baseline, really trying to identify the key obstacles to SME growth and trying to come up with pragmatic and prioritizing the recommendations to put forth for the governments. And I'm happy that I think we have established a good baseline. We have a mix of low-hanging fruits, things that we think governments can enable relatively quickly. For example, the proposal around initiating a visa for entrepreneurs to make it easier for them to travel and make business over the world, to measures that inevitably will take longer term to achieve, but are important in terms of ease of conducting business. In this panel today, we will cover the recommendations in the 5 areas identified: access to international markets, access to finance, access to skills, access to the digital economy and innovation ecosystems, and the ease of doing business. But before we start with the content, let me introduce our panelists. We have a very diverse mix of panelists ranging from different countries, from developing economies to developed ones. We have entrepreneurs, we have representatives of entrepreneurs, and policymakers. So I think we have a good mix to identify the issues from different perspectives. So sitting next to me, let me introduce Mary Vermeer-Andriga. Mary is the Chief Executive Officer and Chair of the Board of Vermeer Corporation, a US-based company, quite sizable SME, 3,400 people. You're operating in 50 or 80 countries, and you're active in industrial and agricultural equipment. Mary is also very active in terms of advocacy around the SME cause. You've been the chair of the National Association of Manufacturers in the US. you are one of the 18 private sector members of President Obama's Export Council. So Mary will both relay her experience running a scaled SMEs and advocacy. Mr. Borisov from Russia. Mr. Borisov heads the non-profit partnership of business associations Opera. So you're representing many entrepreneurs in Russia. And you're also very active pushing policymaking with the government through the, being the deputy chairman of the Russian Government Commission on Competition and Development of Small and Medium Businesses. Mr. Borisov is also a director of School of Technological Entrepreneurship at one of the most prominent Russian universities. So you also talk about efforts to diffuse an entrepreneurship culture and skills. Molly Lesher from the OECD. You're a counselor at the OECD based in Paris. You're supporting the OECD member and partner governments with policy advice in the areas of digital economy, science, technology, and innovation. And prior to that, you focused on trade also for the OECD. And also you've been an economist and working with US Federal and Reserve Bank of Boston. And finally, our last panelist, but not least, Mr. Gökçekin Dinçeler from Turkey. You have been acting as a co-chair of the task force, so I've followed and driven the work through the year. You are a venture capitalist, having really been a driving force in establishing venture capitalism in Turkey. You serve as a director of Turkven Private Equity in Turkey. And you're also chairman of the TOBB Venture Capital Sector Assembly and vice president of TOBB Young Entrepreneurs Council. So really actively promoting a healthy ecosystem in Turkey. Maybe before we dive into the specific recommendations, Mary, we've heard a lot about the importance of SMEs being the locomotive of growth. Maybe if you could illustrate in the US the importance of SMEs in fostering growth and jobs.
Thank you. And I would, before I do that, I would also, as coordinating chair, like to thank my fellow coordinating chair, Melly Uter, for your great job in really being the bedrock through this whole process for the first year as a new task force. Also, our co-chairs were fantastic, the B20 steering committee, who was actually very involved with our committee and task force. I think they gave us a lot of attention, and we really appreciated it. The Accenture team, Laurence and her colleagues were fantastic as our knowledge partners. And as Melly said, the 110 members of our task force who attended in-person meetings, who were on calls, who responded to emails, who many times went back and helped us try to prioritize all the initiatives that we had in front of us to dial it down to these top 5, at least for this year. SMEs, as you've heard again and again, are important for job growth, for new jobs, entrepreneurs, how important all this is for us. And what's interesting is when I talk to other companies of various sizes, whether it's our supply bases, our customers, or maybe our dealer channel, SMEs are the majority of all of those, and in some cases, by far, the huge majority of those entities. So for the health of our individual countries and our world overall, we need a healthy SME base, and that's why this task force is so crucially important. As Laurence mentioned, I've had the opportunity to work in some national groups, and in both of them, the President's Export Council, I've served on the small and medium-sized enterprise task force within the larger trade group because we realize that trade is so important for small and medium-sized enterprises. And if we are going to grow our economy and trade is part of that, we need to be sure we're helping SMEs. We have quite a few agencies like the Small Business Administration. Also, there's been a huge emphasis within export financing to really focus and help SMEs with less complicated forms to fill out and quicker responses. Also, the National Association of Manufacturers is a group of 12,000 manufacturers employing 18 million employees and team members in manufacturing, but about 80% of that group are small and medium size. And so there's a big emphasis within the NAM for abilities to help the small and medium-sized enterprises, even with help and connections with the Commerce Department, which is very helpful and supportive of SMEs. I would just also like to mention the World SME Forum as what a milestone that is for the Turkish presidency to establish this new entity to really focus on SMEs. A couple entrepreneurs, startup people from the United States that you may have heard of, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, both started out, small businesses, have grown very large, obviously. I love the story about the two of them at a dinner party, and the host asked everybody around the table, if you had to say one thing that made a difference in your success, what would it be? Both of those two men said focus. And growing up with my father, who was an entrepreneur, who started with one employee and one small product, which he built himself, whenever we would get into difficult times, he would say, we have to focus. And I think that's why the focus of the World SME Forum is so crucial to really making a difference with SMEs and our contributions to each of our countries and to the global GDP. So I'm very, very proud to have been able to work on this committee.
Many thanks, Mary. Let's move to Mr. Borisov. In terms of shaping the landscape for SMEs in Russia, our task force has focused on 5 obstacles to growth: trade, access to international markets, access to finance, to skills, to the digital economy, and regulations. What's the situation in Russia? How would you characterize the climate for SMEs in Russia and the key areas of policy making in focus?
Thank you very much, Lawrence. Distinguished participants of the conference, first of all, I would like you to understand that Russian economy is pretty young market economy, 25 years old only. 25 years, it's on the one side, on the one hand, it's enough to understand that market is, first of all, competition, and competition needs the particular number of the participants of this process. And if this level of the participants not enough, you will see the negative results. And I will try to understand what I would like to. I will clarify the situation a little bit later. On the other hand, 25 years, it's enough to. It's not enough because Russia is a very huge territory, very huge big population, and Russia still have in our society still have the so-called traditions result of Soviet planned directive economy. It's very important. And majority of our production concentrated in big countries. This is traditions, and we try to persuade our government that we have to grow up the number of participants of this competition. That's why from our point of view, I mean entrepreneurial point of view, the SMEs in Russia so far underestimated. The main attention in our country, our government, our authorities directed to raw materials such as gas, oil. Frankly speaking, we lost a good period of time when the prices for oil and gas were very high. And today crisis proved this situation. SMEs in Russia, in order to understand the current situation, it's only 25% of GDP. It's not enough for deep competition. It's only 27% of our working population involved in SMEs. And it's also not enough. This situation leads to the low level of productivity, lower level of quality, and high cost. Low level of competition doesn't motivate innovation. I'm absolutely sure that innovation is not just that phenomenon. Innovation depends on the level of competition. If you want to compete, if you want to win, you have to borrow some ideas from science, from scientific researchers, to use high level of education. If not, there is no innovation. That's why, if we consider the structure of our SMEs, only 1.5% of enterprises, small and medium-sized enterprises, can be considered as innovative company. 10% of our SMEs work in the sphere of industry, production, only 10%. And more than 50% involved in trade activity, retailing activity. It's the typical situation for today. We don't have the tradition of subcontracting. We cannot include so far. It's maybe sometimes we succeeded, but in general, we didn't include SMEs in the chain, productive chain, with the participation of big companies. It's very, very, very pity. And of course, the level of education. We have not so bad basic education. I would say maybe sometimes very good. You know, our achievement in space. But we don't have tradition to learn people how to work in the real market, in the real market economy, how to be entrepreneur, how to innovate, how to commercialize your ideas, how to promote it to the market. It's very, very important for us today. I would say that we had a pretty good period of time because we had the number of good decisions, we adopted number of useful laws devoted to SMEs, and from a period of time from 2002 and 2012, we grew up about 40%. I mean the share of GDP and the employees. But now we stopped. Unfortunately, now we stopped. And we need additional measures, we need initial efforts, but I suppose a little bit later we will discuss about it.
Exactly, many thanks. I've heard a number of themes that we will discuss more specifically, starting with trade. You mentioned 50% of SMEs export. I think in countries where the statistics exist, it's about a third of SMEs who export, but if you take into account that they support as intermediaries, as subcontractors, larger firms, it's about half of SMEs who do contribute to trade. So not only is it a source of growth for these companies to be able to export more, but it's also a source of productivity, competitiveness, innovation. So So important to include those SMEs better in the global value chains. Molly Lesher, you're at the OECD, you have made a number of surveys about how to best support SMEs in doing that. How would you characterize the opportunities and the challenges for SMEs and entrepreneurs to be more global? And what priorities would you recommend for governments in this space?
First of all, knowledge spillovers between upstream and downstream customers and suppliers is a really important reason for SMEs to go global. And another is access to much, much larger markets. And this is particularly important for SMEs based in smaller countries. Now, I see three main challenges to going global, and the first is about scale. The ability of SMEs to swiftly adopt new technologies, to innovate, to learn by doing, is contained by their small scale. And that limits their ability to go global. It limits their ability to engage in global value chains. And you actually see quite big differences among countries in how their SMEs scale. In France, for instance, startups at inception are much larger than they are in the US. But if you look at those same firms 10 years later, you see that the US firms are much larger. And in part, that's because there's French regulations that discourage French firms from gaining scale. And so what governments can do to help is to reduce these types of regulatory barriers, to lower barriers to entry. So that includes lowering administrative procedures, red tape, facilitating access to finance. But it's also important not to forget that we need to limit barriers to exit. And in this sense, we mean bankruptcy laws that don't over-penalize failure and experimentation. We also need to ensure that there's a level playing field for SMEs. And this is the idea of regulatory incumbency, where you have firms that have been there, they're established, and regulations actually support them continuing. And you see this in sectors in overcapacity, like the steel or shipbuilding sectors. Now, the second challenge is also an opportunity. It's about ICTs and new technologies. And we all know that access to the internet and these types of technologies helps SMEs engage in e-commerce, and such engagement can be significant. In Korea, for example, about 30% of turnover of SMEs comes from e-commerce. But connecting SMEs to these technologies isn't always easy. So governments can help by stimulating investment in broadband, in smart infrastructure, in the Internet of Things, as well as in data analytics. Governments can also promote ICTs as general purpose technologies. And another thing that's really important, and I haven't heard it mentioned today, is we need to preserve the open, decentralized nature of the Internet. And in a post-Snowden world, when internet governance is high on the agenda, we need to make sure that governments come together and make sure we keep the internet open and free. In ICT, we also need to make sure that we don't have barriers to competition, and we need to address market concentration issues. Now, the third challenge involves innovation. The broader challenge for many SMEs is how do you innovate? How do you get the internal capabilities to move up the value chain? And one particularly important aspect of this is managing and protecting their intellectual assets. IPRs are important both for signaling to potential investors and competitors' value, and also to assess knowledge networks. So what can governments do is they can make the IPR regime more SME-friendly. Again, that means lowering administrative burdens. It means making the fee structure appropriate for SMEs. It means improving and easing litigation and enforcement mechanisms. And governments can also help provide access to information for SMEs about foreign IPR regimes.
Mary, from the perspective of both exporting and doing business in many countries, but also the Export Council, you've been really helping us to identify very specific measures that could help illustrate how to make it easier. So what could government do, maybe if you identify a few examples of things that would concretely make a difference for SMEs?
Well, thank you, Laurence. And our goal in this particular initiative is really how do we increase the percentage of SMEs who are involved either directly or indirectly in exports. So again, how the market access, and I think Molly gave some great examples. The fact is, though, standards of quality and certificates to be in the supply chain are just more difficult and more costly for SMEs. And so some of our recommendations in the policy paper are just what I'd like to share a little bit on. Number one would be, how do we get to one-stop assistance for SMEs? E-documentation, fewer steps in a process, and also training for our SMEs on how to comply with the international standards. You know, again, I know many years ago, I think when we started companies, we didn't have the numbers of compliance regulations that we have today. And so it makes it much more complicated and, again, more costly for today's SMEs and today's entrepreneurs. Another very important thing is the harmonization of international standards in the lines of investment, safety, tax, and labor. If we would have more harmonization, that would be certainly easier for more companies to trade into multiple other countries. Ratifying the trade facilitation agreement, I think, is also one of the recommendations coming through one of the other task force. Again, several of the initiatives in the other task force, they all apply to SMEs as well. They can help SMEs on their journey. But definitely being able to simplify the rule of moving goods. And along with that, Laurence mentioned it earlier, the entrepreneurial visa is also important, and one of the things that the task force is recommending to give more mobility to entrepreneurs and small startup companies. And then reliable information is just very, very important. And one thing that has been interesting as I've talked to people, particularly around Washington, is the fact that not every country in the G20 has maybe a focused entity or agency to really help support the SMEs. The United States has the Small Business Administration. I'm sure other countries have different names, but there might in some countries not be a focused agency, and certainly a focused agency to get together with other similar agencies in the G20 would be very helpful. For instance, right now there are the Finance Investment Group can meet with the finance ministers who are here. The folks in the Employment Task Force may be meeting with the labor ministers. But SMEs actually don't have that same coordination, so it might be something also to think about for the future.
We're now going to talk about the second major obstacles to growth for SMEs, which is access to finance. And this is an area that we've shared with the other task force, Financing Growth. But clearly, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, this resulted really in a credit crunch for SMEs. And in many countries, actually, we can see that today the availability of credit and lending for SMEs has not come back to pre-crisis level. In many cases, the collateral requirements have become more stringent. Two aspects we focused on in our task force was, one, how can we make it easier for any financial institutions to assess the risk on SMEs? Because obviously, if you have better access to information, you can make better informed decisions, and hopefully this will enable banks to lend more. So Gökçekin, can you share some of the recommendations of the task force on this aspect of favoring access to finance?
Sure. Well, this question, as being in the venture capital and private equity industry, I think I'm repeatedly asked about financing, and Nail Bey rightly emphasized that point in his introduction remarks, that although this is not the only thing that holds back SMEs in terms of getting larger and more successful, definitely financing is one of the more important issues, access to finance. And when you think about, of course, financing, this could be either equity or lending, credit. And going back to the point Laurence made with regards to the risk and information, I think this is where many of our recommendations around this area comes more specific and actionable. And this is an area also we have a significant joint sort of work with Financing the Growth Task Force. So they have also picked one of this as one of their important areas in terms of how to make sure that SMEs get their fair share of financing in their efforts to grow and be more successful. Now, when we look at the overall issue of financing, be it lending or equity, in terms of getting the risk lower or perceived risk lower, information plays an important role. As we heard this morning from central bank governors, that with regards to other types of investments, but this is also an investment in a sense, that there is a lot of liquidity in the world. There are lots of investors looking for good investments. And at the end of the day, the question was, what would an investor look for? Definitely for the highest possible return for a lowest possible risk. And when we approach this issue of SME financing, two things actually will probably play an important role in terms of both bank lending or other types of lending and equity financing, which is to provide adequate, financial reporting on the side of SMEs, and also making available any historic data for SMEs available to all interested parties. Now, if I may go a little bit more specific on these areas, in terms of providing adequate financing, financial statements and reporting, the governments actually can be instrumental here in terms of creating easy to use, but also more standardized reporting. And this goes back to the areas of online, ability to do these things online, which helps in terms of providing the information, but also later helps in terms of sharing that information. And there are some examples from around the world that governments actually doing this more and more, getting more standardized reporting, making it easier and less costly for SMEs to comply, but at the same time having this information available for lenders. The second area is with regards to, again, information and financial statements. I think this is an interesting area where creating regulatory frameworks and standards so that all types of collaterals can be actually made available from SMEs to the lenders. As Nail Bey mentioned, when an SME starts, and probably he was referring to more of a manufacturing SME, that they start with a land and a factory and machinery. But also a good chunk of economy these days are also non-manufacturing services where you have difficulty, if you are an SME owner in that or an entrepreneur, difficulty showing collaterals in that sense. And the banks or the lenders that are sort of accustomed to working with collaterals, this poses a challenge. But then there's other types of solutions where these are immovables, but there are movable, collaterals, movable assets. And also a biggest asset for SMEs, I believe, from my experience, is accounts receivable, the financing coming from trade. So any mechanisms that will help, collect this information, make this a reliable information in terms of both ownership rights and the existence of these assets, these might be actually quite useful in terms of getting those SMEs with no hard assets or fixed assets and showing these as collaterals, or for those even having these assets, having additional collaterals for increased sort of borrowing capability. So, and I know in Turkey, the Treasury has been working on some mechanisms to create a registry. Again, I'm not suggesting that these are easy things to do, but there is a need to actually make this thing acceptable both from the part of lenders who might continue to demand some type of collateral, but also make other types of collaterals available to the lenders from the SMEs and make it easy and in a systematic way so that the whole system can work effectively. Now, this is all about reporting and financial statements and providing the information. Now, another aspect of information is, of course, the history, that the SMEs that they work with a lender or two, when they go to the next one, how easily is this information available to other lenders? And here again, the regulation comes into play, going back to what can governments do. Here I just want to give one example from Turkey, because this is the one that I know really well, is the central registry, which is the Kredi Kayıt Bürosu. By law, this is an institution that is allowed to share the customer information. So the banks and other types of lenders share their information with this institution, and that institution, within properly defined rules and regulations, share that information with other potential lenders. And actually, the owner of this institution is lenders themselves. So it is a not-for-profit organization, but providing this central role in sharing information. And they have been actually quite active in recent years. They have opened up their system to individuals on a per day for each individual accessing their own information, which is available for other lenders as well. And the latest numbers that I have, which might be much more than this right now, but there were hundreds of millions of inquiries on individuals on a per year basis from lenders, and there were millions of inquiries on the companies, again from the lenders. So these type of collecting this information, centralizing this information, but also providing a regulatory framework and necessary legal protections around this information is important to facilitate. I believe this is a good example for lending purposes. And the next step, again, related to this, could be providing this type of, or encouraging this type of access within certain legal limits to other institutions, so that the more information collected and the more information shared about SMEs, of course this is through SMEs' own participation in this system. This is not mandatory. Unless they want to access these lenders, they don't have to participate. But these type of steps can make it easier to collect and share and help lenders actually assess the riskiness better, and instead of compensating lack of information with a higher premium on either rates or higher requirements on collaterals, hopefully this will make things easier. One final point which we have heard today, I would like to emphasize for those who haven't heard, is these e-commerce platforms. Today we have heard Alibaba, and from our work we know DHgate is another example from China through Ms. Wang, who is a co-chair on this task force, that these platforms, which start as a trading platform, later become a financing platform. Why? Because they do have very solid and long-term payment information and accounts receivable information. Accounts receivable, as I mentioned earlier, is a good collateral and a historic account payable and accounts receivable information provides good information about that SME's ability to grow and to generate funds and use of funds. So these type of new mechanisms, I believe, will help going forward with the help of governments and proper legislation, lower the risk coming from lack of information, but also B, make more lenders aware and access the information so that they can lend to SMEs. Thank you.
Thank you. One aspect as well, you mentioned alternative sources of funding, whether equity or lending. Obviously, there's the whole crowdfunding development, but you haven't mentioned, you're a venture capitalist yourself, you haven't said anything about venture capitalism, so maybe just a quick word on, we know it's the availability of funds, venture capitalist funds is very different across countries. From your perspective in Turkey and through the advocacy work you're doing, maybe a quick word on what would it take to fuel more funds towards venture capitalists. And
well, I was focused on more lending side because it's more widely available and more widely cited problem. But of course, equity funding is another source of funding. And here, I mean, venture capital is a very well-established fact and practice in developed countries. And I guess we can rephrase the question as what would it take or what does it take to get this type of mechanisms more available in developing countries. Again, I can speak from my experience in Turkey. Here, there are different factors which we will probably get into in our other recommendations. But let me just start providing the context that this is, from equity perspective, more of an ecosystem issue where, you need to have companies, but here, again, within the whole SME universe, we start focusing on a smaller subset of SMEs from the perspective of, let's say, venture capitals, which is, let's say, high potential, high growth potential, high value creation potential SMEs. Now, assuming that this is our set that we're talking about right now, then the question, again, becomes a question of, the entrepreneur or the owner of that company itself and the team that he has, so it's about skills. And B, it is a question about the market, the product, the market fit, and how they can actually, you know, seize that opportunity. And also it goes, also it touches on the issues of the existing regulations in that market with regards to, you know, investing in this kind of high potential startups or SMEs, and then being able to work with them and grow the company and then exit the investment. Here, exit becomes an important you know, phrase, because the investors, the equity investors, would like to see also an exit potential, which means it is not about the company, but it's about the next owner of the company. So in Turkey, which I would prefer coming back to this later, but you need to work on all these aspects. It is not just financing issue, it goes beyond financing issue. The funds that are available, people would like to invest high potential companies, but other factors also needs to be in place.
Yeah. And we come back to that on the ecosystem parts of our recommendation. So let me move on to the third topic, which was the skills side. And it's both, what we considered was both, how do we induce more people to envisage entrepreneurship as a career? How do we make it more attractive? And as well, how do we help companies build up their skills base? Because we know from statistics the difference in terms of growing often comes to the quality of the managerial talent. So education, either at the university system or through the lifelong cycle of companies, is an important topic. Mary, you've been an educator, that's what I've heard in our months working together, but you also co-leading the STEM coalition in your state. So STEM for all the science, technology skills, mathematics skills that often are in high demand. Can Can you maybe summarize some of the issues and recommendations we've put forth in the areas of how to foster those entrepreneurial talent?
Yes, this is a favorite topic of mine as a former teacher, so thank you very much. Really, I think we have to continue to think about two different kinds of skills or different kinds of education. One is the technical skills that are needed, for instance, in my business for welding and machining, engineering, IT, and many of which are really STEM skills. Today, there's almost no job that doesn't need math and technology background. And then another set of education skills that are needed are in leadership. And we have some very nice information in our policy document about agility, agility leadership, and helping particularly entrepreneurs learn how to not only take the business to startup, but then how to build it and continue to grow it because they're able to be agile and be able to adjust to what happens in their workforce and in their markets. On the technical STEM side, just a couple of interesting stats. The Federal Reserve in the U.S. states that for every 2 jobs available, there's 2 jobs available actually for every unemployed person. So why do we have the unemployment? Well, it's because they don't have the skills in many cases. And I just picked up another tidbit today, and maybe this was in one of the other sessions, that in the Eurozone area, it's been pretty much studied that if there are really good, strong technical skills and colleges really supported by the business and the industry sector, the unemployment of youth is 5% or below. That is very low, and we all know that the whole area of unemployment in youth is one of our major issues and one of the things that we're really trying to work on as a B20. Another stat, 62% of entrepreneurs will say that they have a very difficult time finding talent. I know that in the National Association of Manufacturers, we do a survey every year. What are your top obstacles to keep you from growing? And always in the top 3, and often the top 1 or 2, it's the skilled workforce. It tends to continue to be an issue. In Iowa, our state government has said that there is 1 qualified person for every 3.5 STEM jobs, which means we have a lot of STEM jobs going unfilled at this time. And on the entrepreneurial side, again, that access to finance and markets is going to be very important, but then that next step of leadership for entrepreneurs continues to be something that we need to keep a focus on. So the recommendations are that the G20 governments really continue to work for all the linkages between all levels of education, and I personally think this has got to start the K through 12 area as far as STEM and technical skills, and maybe even agility, right? As well as community colleges, tech schools, universities of all levels, including the incubators that can make a real difference to do those startups. I know in our state, we have incubator centers in each of our regent universities. And not only is there space there and administrative help for startup companies with 1 or 2 people, but there's also mentoring help for how they do their financials, how they do their marketing, how they start to build out their business with the employment opportunities. So I think those linkages continue to be very important and be important for our G20 governments to also invest in. In the state of Iowa, I've been very pleased to be part of our STEM initiative. Our lieutenant governor has co-chaired this initiative since the start, and we have really been able to coordinate with all levels of education, government, business and industry of all sorts, to be able really to put a whole lot more focus on the STEM initiative. And one of the things that our company's done for 10 years, but in the state now we've done this for several years, is focus on internships or externships for teachers. So teachers particularly in the K through 12 area. And teachers in the summer come into our businesses, and they are paid internships, and learn about all the opportunities, but also about the skills that are needed for their students to be successful in the future. And what's interesting, when we started this 10 years ago, we had so many teachers that came in and said, well, I never thought about suggesting my students should think about manufacturing as a career because I thought it was leaving the United States. And certainly after they come in, this past summer, one of the teachers said, I came in as a manufacturing snob. And she said, in a very bad way. I didn't think the jobs in manufacturing were the ones I wanted to encourage my students to look at. Well, when teachers leave that experience, they have an entirely different outlook on what are the opportunities, but also what are the skills needed. I loved one junior high teacher who spent 3 weeks with us, who at the end said, I spent time with welders, I spent time with machinists, I spent time with the IT, with the engineers, and I can go back and say very confidently to my junior high students, you cannot hide from math. You have to have math, and you need to understand how important it is. We did a survey of the teachers who've been involved in these internships, externships in the state of Iowa. 90% of these teachers said it was the best professional development they had ever had. Now, university people might not like hearing me say that, but they said it was the most practical, best professional development ever. And the same businesses who had these teachers also said, 96% of them said that each of the teachers contributed greatly, significantly into their business the time that they spent there. So I think that we are making progress. There's a lot of focus on STEM. There's also getting to be more focus on entrepreneurism and the incubator concept and how universities and governments can help support these initiatives. And I think but we need to continue. I think it was maybe Korn Ferry's, one of their documents that said in 2010, some of the top 10 jobs were not even on the radar screen in 2004. And I'm sure if we look at 2015-16, we would say the same things about 2010. It's an evolving world, and it will take continual effort and focus to stay up with it, particularly for all of our SMEs who need the skilled workforce to be profitable and to be able to have growth.
Sorry, I was saying, I assume we run until 6. We started late, but we'll go to 6. But I'd like to make sure we save time for some questions at the end. So let me move on at space. There's 2 more topics we'd like to cover, access to digital economy and the sort of business regulatory environment for SMEs to thrive. So on the digital topic, we heard in the digital panel there are huge variations in terms of, across countries, in terms of ability of SMEs to access the infrastructure, but also leverage the infrastructure. At Accenture, we have an index, the Accenture Strategy Digital Index, and we looked at 17 of the G20 countries, clearly on a scale of 0 to 100. Literally, the scores in terms of quality of infrastructure, but leverage of the infrastructure for SMEs range from 20-something for the lowest performing countries to about 70. So in every country, there's space to improve. Molly, from an OECD perspective, I know this is also a very core topic for you. What would you say, what can governments do to really put in place the right environment for SMEs to take advantage of this innovation and opportunities through technology?
First, I'd like to say that we have been looking at this issue. It's really important, and I'm going to be shameless for 1 second and show you a book my colleagues did on measuring the digital economy, which is actually really, really difficult to do. I won't go into any of the examples I was going to talk about because they've been covered in the other session, but just say that when we think about 21st century infrastructure, digital infrastructure is really critical. And it isn't just high-quality broadband. That's really, really important. But it's also about internet exchange points, and it's about data itself. We're at the beginning of the Internet of Things, or some people call it the Internet of Everything, where connected devices are going to be spewing massive amounts of data, and people are going to be using it in really innovative ways. So we need to make sure that SMEs tap into this technology. And we see three main ways where governments can help. One I've already mentioned, which is having an open, decentralized internet. This is so that SMEs can access all of the IT applications and services that are available, that the internet isn't balkanized, for lack of a better word. Also, broadband, again, is important. Also, to develop policies to increase ICT adoption within SMEs. And there's a nice example in Colombia where the government has encouraged large companies who are applying for public tender to include in those proposals ways that they're going to connect with their SME suppliers by ICT. And then those offers are prioritized, and it's actually worked really, really well. Another area is the one Mary just mentioned very eloquently about the development of STEM skills and digital skills. And I'll just add to that generic skills, because we are on the cusp of Industry 4.0 or the next production revolution. And it's very, very true that we don't know what the jobs are going to look like in 10 years, in 15 years, in 20 years. And so we need to give people generic skills that we know will be important so that they will be adaptable. Things like critical thinking and problem solving are another set of skills that we think are really important.
Perfect. And then there was the ecosystem aspect that Gökçe King, you mentioned. There may be in a minute or two a few additional points you want to make on this.
Yeah, very quickly. When we talk about ecosystem, this we can view both as the overall entrepreneurship ecosystem, and also being entrepreneurship in this context is all these high potential startups. Actually, it's all about innovation ecosystem. And very briefly, as I mentioned, the most simple way to think about it is 4 pillars. One, the individuals themselves, the entrepreneurs and the team that work on the issues. Then, of course, there is universities and R&D centers that is actually the source of scientific knowledge and innovation for these products and services. And the third thing is, of course, the customers, which is in this case large corporations, large companies, and others that uses the products that creates the actual environment for the SMEs or the entrepreneurs to exist, and the collaboration between them. And finally, the financing, which we talked before. From our experience in Turkey, I will just say 2-3 highlights of learnings. One, it is important to actually work on these pillars simultaneously. Pushing one too fast or too forward at the expense of others is not really helpful. It end up wasting resources. So because the interconnection and the positive link between these different pillars is important to grow the system together. The second thing is, I think, which is in my mind the more important area is we continue to support and to focus on individual pillars, such as programs that provide financial support to, let's say, individual companies, or programs that actually give training to individuals. I think these are all good and useful and continue. But I think more important thing is going to the next step, which is on top of these programs, start programs supporting the ecosystem so that you actually start developing, let's say, the angel investor network. You support the creation of angel investor networks so that they start supporting the funding of companies instead of you continue to support the funding. You work on fund of funds as a support mechanism so that fund of funds start funding the VC funds who will then end up, investing in companies. And you work on, let's say, technology transfer offices so that the universities actually start making this a more institutional approach. So the move from individual support points to ecosystem support points has also been quite useful in our context.
Many thanks. And the last topic that I'd like to touch on very briefly, because I do want to leave time for one or two questions. It's a huge topic. It's the whole ease of doing business. The World Bank measures regularly every year how countries are making progress on this concept of ease of doing business. And actually, every country or most countries in the world do make progress. It's getting easier and easier to start a business, to grow a business, but obviously it's a long journey. Maybe, Mr. Borisov, I'm going to ask you a very challenging task. Maybe if you could tell us from your perspective if there are 3 areas of improvement that would really make a difference for you as an entrepreneur in Russia, in which areas would the Russia government need to focus? What type of improvement in the business environment would really be the 1 or 2 things you would put forth?
Thank you. So far, our place in doing business ranking not so high, not so prestigious. Unfortunately, a lot of bureaucratic problem, corruption, influence entrepreneurial climate. But I suppose, and I'm absolutely sure, that we succeeded in the sphere of tax regulation. Mm-hmm. And all our entrepreneurs told that now it's easier, it's not so routine, it's not necessarily to negotiate with the visitors from tax office. Everything is organized on the distance, digitally, I would say. It's very good. But nevertheless, from time to time, we feel mistakes of our authorities, of our government. I will give you one example. 3 years ago, it was decision of our Ministry of Labor, they participated somewhere here nearby, to rise 2.5 times so-called social payment for individual entrepreneurs. 2.5 times. What's the reaction of business? During 1 month, about more than 500,000 individual entrepreneurs closed their business. It was tragedy for entrepreneurship, believe me. That's why our recommendation to governmental authorities, first of all, to consider smallest company, individual entrepreneurs, self-employed people, not from fiscal point of view, but rather than from social point of view. This is very important, because these mistakes leads to many problems. And another problem in our society is so-called dark sector for entrepreneurs. The entrepreneurs who doesn't work anywhere. They work somewhere, but nobody knows about their activity. They don't pay any patent, any tax. Could you compare? We have officially in small business of Russia 17 million employees. In dark sector, it's approximately calculated 20 million people. That's why it's very important to create the opportunity, conditions to take these people from this dark sector, because this dark sector is the source for corruption. If you don't pay, somebody come to you and ask to share with him. That's why it's very important. Also, it's very important, and we feel it, maybe some countries also feel, to motivate local authority, municipal authority. Unfortunately, our local authority, first of all, try to ask Minister of Finance to subsidize the economy, but they don't want to develop their small business in their territory. And another point I would like to ask if it is possible, to raise the attitude toward business associations. I know that today Christine Lagarde told about this, that authorities, government should listen to business, to borrow some ideas, not to ignore business association. Sometimes we feel, because our feelings, it's very, very sharp. We feel very, very, all the details of business. And if our governmental authorities ignore it, it's also lack of information for them, first of all. And finally, of course, we need, Russia has a lot of potential niches for SMEs, because underdeveloped small business. And we are waiting foreign companies. But it will be much more easier for them if they have the informational resource about the activities, unification, as told Mary, unification of standard, all the regulations in how to cross the frontier. A lot of our partners organizations all over the world told us about this necessity. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Every country obviously has their own areas of focus. I mean, for certain, it might be the social aspects, the social rigidity in the labor market. For certain, it might be the tax. So at the B20 task force level, I think our point of view is really to reiterate the need to continue the progress on making it easier, and also leveraging the digital technologies, because the more we can make those processes digital, the more, the simplest it is for companies to access government services, single point of contacts, eliminating most of the time some unnecessary procedures. So clearly as well pushing the continuous investment in governments in digitizing the government processes. We're getting to the close of our session. Maybe we do have time for one or two questions if there's a pressing question, and then we close. Yes, I'm not sure if there are microphones. Yes.
Çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Ben 60 yıllık bir sanayiciyim Türkiye'de ve tarım makineleri imal ediyorduk ve tarım makineleri imal eden bütün kuruluşların da başkanıydım ben.
So maybe Göçekin, you can help us translate the question.
Türkiye'deki eğer konuyla ilgili benden bilgi almak isterlerse 5-10 dakikada ben bilgi vermek isterim. Bütün bu anlattıklarıyla ilgili. Türkiye'de ne oluyor diye.
Onu isterseniz bitirdikten sonra yapalım. Şeyleri tutmayalım diye.
Artık bitiyor bugün zaten herhalde.
Yani şu toplantıdan sonra. Yani sorunuz varsa alalım. Bilgiyi bitirdikten
Bir iki tane sorayım o zaman. Devlette sattıkları malları Rusya'da paralarını alıyorlar mı? Yani mısırın biçildiği anda mısır parasını hemen veriyorlar mı? 6 ay sonra mı veriyorlar? Birincisi. Para önemli çünkü çiftçi.
Purchases goods from companies. Yes, sir. The question was actually, the gentleman asked that in Russia, as an example, the government, as a customer of services and products from the companies, is the regular payer, or does it pay on time?
Ödüyorlar mı?
I don't quite understood the questions. Let me discuss later together with you. I will clarify the situation for in what purpose you will pay and what not. It's no problem.
Sonra konuşalım.
Çünkü 8-10 tane kadar Türkiye bütün tarımla ilgili her şeylerini halletmiş durumda. Hatta Avrupa'ya da gümrüksüz mal verdiği için Tarım makineleriyle ilgili hiçbir sorunu yok Türkiye'nin. Çiftçinin hiçbir sorunu yok yani çiftçinin. Hepsinin maddelerini yazdım ben burada.
Tamam. Well, after the closure, we will touch base with the gentleman.
Maybe the last question, and then we'll close. Mr. at the back.
Michael Nelson, I'm with Cloudflare, which is a web security firm in the Bay Area. I'm curious that in the whole conversation we didn't hear any discussion of intellectual property, even though in the United States we've seen a lot of cases where small and medium-sized enterprises are subject to lawsuits, mostly because patent trolls and people who abuse the patent law try to extort or undermine these companies. But in some cases, copyright lawsuits, trademark lawsuits, which small businesses are not equipped to defend themselves against. So I'd be interested in any comments the panelists might have on whether there's a need for copyright and trademark reform, particularly with regard to small businesses, which are often finding themselves in court, sometimes for cases that shouldn't be even admitted to court.
Yeah, I mean, this topic was addressed at a very high level when it comes to ease of doing business. We try to list areas of focus, and clearly the IP aspect was part of it, but we didn't more explicitly explore avenues, so it's lumped as one of those barriers that, among others, like labor laws, labor market flexibility, regulations, generally speaking, that we advise governments to look at.
May I?
Yes.
Just to, I think this is a very, significant issue, but in very specific countries where you actually have patent laws and intellectual property protection so that someone can claim and get a result through that. In some other countries, actually, the problem is at the other end of spectrum, where, which is also another problem for SMEs, where whatever they produce in terms of intellectual property, they cannot protect, effectively. So, your point is a valid one, which is at one end of the spectrum, and there are still lots of countries and lots of SMEs dealing with the problems at the other end of the spectrum. And by itself, this is a very, very important issue from both ends. But as Laurent said, in our work, this has been addressed because it's a very diverse, topic, not as in-depth as the other areas.
And Mrs. Lesher, do you have some points to add?
Yeah, I just want to say I agree with you entirely, and that was one of the points I was trying to get across in the innovation discussion. Protecting and managing intellectual assets for SMEs is critical for many reasons. It can position themselves competitively vis-a-vis larger firms, it signals perspective value, all of those things. And one of the things that we think governments can do is to make the IPR system more SME friendly, by making litigation and enforcement mechanisms easier, by making costs adequate for SMEs, by streamlining administrative barriers. So I agree with you entirely.
All right, I think it's time to close. I'm sure you're all eager to go to the dinner. Mary, why don't you, as coordinating chair, why don't you have the closing remarks?
Thank you very much. Yesterday, Mr. Kent mentioned it's time to get away from all think tanks and get to more do tanks. And I think SMEs, SMEs are doers. And I do believe that all of you who are SMEs out there or who work with SMEs, to really continue to look at how can we be advocates for the things that are important that we've talked about today in our policy paper to really help SMEs move forward in the future. future. And I truly believe that SMEs talking to elected officials in our own governments is maybe one of the most effective ways to help move our governments forward. So I encourage all of us to be involved in that. And I'd just like to thank all of you for being a great audience, for hanging in there till 6 o'clock. The Turkish presidency took a huge step with their focus on SMEs and also on the World SME Forum. So thank you to this presidency, and we look forward to this continuing to be a big topic in the Chinese presidency. So thank you all very much. Have a good evening.